Jemar, welcome back a second time to A World of Difference. It's so lovely to see you today.
It is fantastic to be back. Good to see you again.
We are going to talk about another one of your books, and thank you so much because the process of writing a book is so wild, and publishing is a huge difference of what it used to be, and it involves all kinds of things like building a social media platform to promote the book. Pre-orders are a big deal, but also in many cases, the prep for the book has involved some research, and that might involve travel, and then traveling for a book tour can also be a part of it. How have you been handling travel? I would love to hear your perspective on it, Jamar.
Well, I know I'm speaking to a veteran traveler and an experienced traveler, so it's good to talk about it. I do a bunch of traveling for speaking engagements for the book tour now, and I have all these thoughts in my head because usually I'm traveling solo, and like there's nobody talks anymore on planes. Not that I really have a burning desire to, but it's like off limits now that everyone has headphones. So it's funny to me. I just observe stuff, right? Like it's funny to me when people travel all dressed up. Like some of it can be functional, like if you're stepping off the plane straight into a meeting or something. But like it also looks like people are dressing to be seen. And I'm like, that is just so not functional. Like, there's all kinds of delays. I can't tell you how many times I've had to run from one gate to the next on a tight connection. And I'm like, you just can't do that in for guys like a suit and for ladies heels or something like that. So I dress very comfortably, and it's just like a black sweatsuit. It's a zipper hoodie. It's a t-shirt, and it's always the same. Like I don't think about it anymore, just because I don't have the mental bandwidth to do that. And there's all kinds of other little stuff. Like it's getting so much harder, I feel like these days, to get a ride share from the airport. Um, it's just a maze to get to like the physical spot where these places pick you up. And then there's really long waits, there's surge pricing, there's all this stuff. So I have taken to just getting a regular old taxi, if because they're there, they're waiting, you give them the address, they all take a card now, and it's not that much different than rideshare. So just some little things as I am a road warrior for these speaking about racial justice.
I love it. I agree with you. I just recently got back from China. And when I got off the plane from San Francisco to Shanghai, there was a woman in the immigration line in high heels. And I thought, what
Mm.
planet? I mean, for me, I like I wear, we're going to say athleisure. It's basically
Yes,
pajamas when I
absolutely.
fly like on a 10-hour plus flight.
Yeah, no zippers required.
Exactly. I have TSA pre-check, I have global entry. I
Yes,
want to go in and
yes,
out as fast as I can.
yes.
No zippers, no metal. But I do have if it's cold, I'll have like a trench coat and a scarf because I need a blanket for the plane and my scarf. So there's like it
That's
looks a
smart.
little bit cute on the outside, but it's basically pajamas is what I'm wearing.
Stylishly, absolutely. It's functional and you look fine, and it just shocks me, like when people get dressed to the nines. I'm like, okay, to each their own, but I got past that a long, long time ago. So yeah, and then
Good for you.
hotels are a whole thing where usually I don't have time to like get in town and go to a local restaurant, right? So now I'm like looking very closely at the quality of hotel food, and I
Hmm.
usually just do like chicken wings and a salad because you're pretty safe there.
Yeah, it's good to have your go-tos and your standards. Of course, when you're traveling internationally, that's not easy. And you've had to do that in your research for this book, right? So how did
Yeah.
that go for you?
So all of my experiences inform the book. So my latest book is The Spirit of Justice: True Stories of Faith, Race, and Resistance. And over the past several few years recently, I don't travel a ton internationally, maybe once or twice a year, but I've gotten to go some really cool places. So I went to South Africa several years ago now, but an unforgettable experience. There was one line in there, it pertained to history. We were going in a small group, and then we were interacting with some Black South Africans, and one of them said to my colleague traveling with me, who was also a Black American, he said, living in America, you were like a tree without roots, but now you're home and you have roots. And it was just
Mm,
this like pilgrimage of people of African American descent going back to places in Africa, feeling a sense of home, had another trip to Africa more recently, and we went to Benin, which a lot of
Mm.
people either A, haven't heard of, and B, have no concept
I've
of
heard
like
of
where
it.
it is
I
or
know
what it is.
West Africa, right? Like
I
tiny
know
little.
you know, yes, absolutely. But so many people are just like kind of cock their
Where?
head sideways and frown. But yeah, I didn't know much about it before I went. But yes, West Africa, and it was colonized by the French, so it's a French-speaking Black African country, which threw me for a loop because I had zero context for French, and I'm like, I don't
Mm.
know even how to say goodbye, thank you, introduce myself. This was wild. It was a very fish out of water experience. But that was powerful because being on the West Coast, it was a slave port on the coast, and so we got to go to the beach on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, and they have monuments there and whatnot. And I wasn't prepared for how powerful a moment it would be for me to think that at some point, somewhere along the lines in my ancestry, my ancestors were on a ship that took off from somewhere in West Africa, perhaps even Benin. And so that was just like a really powerful, sacred moment. And all of that kind of bring into the work of researching history, telling the stories, and trying to make the case that we still have a lot to learn about history and the ways history can form and shape us today.
Wow. I've heard, of other friends that have done a similar journey and gone to West Africa in different places. And the experience of it is very visceral for a lot of people. I
Mhm.
remember seeing the photos of when Barack Obama and Michelle Obama went to a port, and I'm forgetting the name of it, in West Africa, and just hearing them talk about it. And of course, you have to kind of keep it all a bit under a lid and make it a little polished when you're the president of the United States. But I could tell even in their recounting of it how powerful it is to do that. And yet, a lot of what we understand is that this trauma is embedded in DNA, and so that visceral experience
Mhm.
makes sense, right? And it also makes sense why people aren't often prepared for it, because there's so much, it's cloaked in shame. It's the thing we don't talk about. So how do you process all of that? Are you still processing it? How do you look at that experience now?
I really think studying history is a spiritual experience. Because history isn't just about like names and dates and factoids. History is ultimately about identity. It's about where you come from, how you got to where you are, forces and people and ideas that have formed and shaped you, oftentimes without you even being cognizant of it. So when we do go back and look at it, then kind of the mystery of ourselves the fog starts to clear a little bit. Um, I mean, for me, going to Benin, it was yes, there was that sense of rootedness that I have a history before slavery, before racism, before exploitation. And there's a rich heritage linguistically, culturally, culinarily that is ours, even if we've been disconnected for generations and generations. And so it just kind of, for me, stoked a hunger to keep going back. Africa is a
Hmm.
massive country or massive continent with more than 50 different countries, right? And each of them is different. And within each, there's so much variety. So there's still so much more exploring to do just of that one continent. And then it's been exciting seeing so many, in my case, so many Black Americans going abroad now, some moving and forming expat communities in different locations. Has me, in the back of my mind dreaming like, where might the next place be? Yeah.
I love that so much. We had some, because of our 10 years in Singapore, and there were a significant amount of Americans. Well, it had like 1 million expats. It's a big
Mm,
expat place to live. There's American military, there's oil, there's a lot of American companies there, and we had several African American friends, right? And some of that was during the Trump years, where people weren't
mm,
feeling safe here for a lot
yeah.
of reasons. And they just were like, we don't want to raise our Black boys in the US, and I was like, oh, that's fair. And so we did see a lot more of them during those years. But I also think it's so beautiful that now you've been able to explore your roots, and it has given you such a curiosity for the diversity among the Black community in the United States. I think that, so much of the work is to help people understand it's not a monolith. There's the origin stories are so unique depending on where in Africa. Was it French colonized? Was it Dutch? Was it Portuguese? Was it British? Those different types of colonization were extremely different. How enslaved peoples were transported around the world on these, ships against their own free will. Very different circumstances as well. And so as you've sort of unpacked the diversity of that, what are some of the surprising things that you've found or something that's intrigued you in some way?
In terms of historically or traveling?
Yeah, or both.
Both. To me, I think it's somewhat universal. They talk, there's even a term for it, the traveling bug, right? Like once you get a taste of it, you just want more of it. Usually that's what, if you have a semi-positive experience, right? There's some nightmare stories, but
Yeah.
in general, when you go someplace else, I think it actually taps into that commonality, that shared humanity that we have of it is a massively big world. And it's sort of ironic that when you travel, you see diversity, you see something different, but also you start to learn like there's this huge, big human family that is beautiful in so many ways that we can explore. And honestly, I think, I don't think it's saying too much that you can catch a history bug too. That's kind of what happened to me. Like history is a way that you can travel time without ever leaving your living room, if you will. And when you dip into different people's stories across eras, it makes you eager for more. I mean, I often recount the first graduate level course I took in history was at Jackson State University. And to this day, it is the only class where I ever did all the reading ahead of time. I was just like, I was hooked, and I got through one book and I'm like, I can't wait for, the next assignment to go on to the next one. So I just read and I read and I read. And that was me, part of me catching the history bug, right? And what I hope in this book with the Spirit of Justice is it strikes people that same way. I mean, there's over 50 different characters and institutions I profile. There's something in there that's going to be new, exciting, different, intriguing. And to me, this book is really a hallway. And every figure, every character profile is a doorway into another room. And there's more doors. And you can just kind of get lost exploring.
That's incredible. It's so exciting. I do think the intersection of travel and history has been significant in my life. That Venn diagram has just been a beautiful place to live. Whenever I travel to a new place or even a place I've been a lot of times, I like to find something historical, local that, is meaningful. I speak 6 languages. Mandarin's not one of them. But when I was in China recently on a business trip, I did stay at a very nice hotel. And it was like a bird's eye view of the city of Wuxi, which is about 3 hours from Shanghai, where our company has an office and a manufacturing site. Across the street was like this old 2,000-year-old. It's like, how could you not just like go see these things, right?
Yeah.
And so even though I speak Mandarin, sometimes they'd have English, and there's just a story of a little local man who had been a busker, and now he's some famous, musician after he died.
Wow.
I love just learning the local stories and seeing what people value and what they highlight about their history. And, as if you visited Chinatown in San Francisco, for example, where I live, you wouldn't get that necessarily because everything that happened here is, focused on Chinese, the Exclusion Act and different things that affected them and the history of once they came here. But it is so important to see like origins of peoples. And I think that what your book is doing is giving us that curiosity. And I think it's so important to do for such a time as this, because we are in an election season that is so awful. And hearing things like former President Trump recently saying that Haitians are eating dogs and cats. Like, first of all, Kamala Harris laughing at him was the appropriate response. I'm just going to say that's laughable.
Just ridiculousness, yes.
But I know, I mean, even like, people like John Legend, I think is from that town, and he came out with a statement, this isn't happening, and then I think Steph Curry, who's one of our, basketball players here in the Bay Area, came out and said, this what is going on, because they, have connections in their families in that community. And at the same time, treating Haitian immigrants as some monolith with all Black people or all immigrants is like the thing that's happening. So when you bring the diversity out, it allows us to humanize, just like you said. We're part of a human family. When people travel, we often recognize that, or when they live abroad, which is why I always advocate traveling if possible,
Absolutely. Yes.
because it does open people's minds. So as you're processing some of that with all the work that you do and all that's happening, very, propaganda type things happening, how do you process that?
So I just did a presentation for an executive education course on race, religion, and politics. So how I process that is historically. One of the questions I posed in that class was, why do you think so many Black Americans tend to vote the same way? Parties have switched platforms. So it's
Right.
recently in the past several decades, it's Democrats, right? But why do you think that is? And this is an especially important question for anyone to answer, but especially white people to answer, and in particular white Christians to answer. Why is it, do you think, that most Black Americans, by a wide margin, I'm talking upper 80s, lower 90%, vote Democratic, and even higher for Black women as you break it out? Um,
Yeah.
and there's a history to it. So I talked about the Dred Scott decision in the 1850s, right? 1857. And the fact that this was an enslaved Black man whose enslaver brought him from Missouri, a slave state, up to Wisconsin, a free state. Then when they went back to Missouri, Dred Scott sued because he said, well, since we crossed state lines into a free state, I should be free. I was there, you know? It was almost as if, like you had escaped and gone on the Underground Railroad and gotten to a free state, and now you were free. Um, so he's arguing this case in court. It goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court rules against him, but not for the reasons most people would think, which is, oh, it doesn't count. You were still enslaved even when you crossed state lines. That wasn't the case they made. The case that the Supreme Court said, well, as an enslaved person, you're not even a citizen, so you can't sue. If you are not considered an actual citizen of this country, you have no standing in court, no legal rights.
Wow.
And so that was 1857, right? 1868, first election after the Civil War. You have the Seymour Blair ticket, and their motto, their campaign slogan was, "This is a white man's country. Let white men rule." And it's like, why are Black people voting a certain way when they could vote, right?
Yeah.
There had to be an amendment to the Constitution just so that you couldn't discriminate. First of all, that you had birthright citizenship or naturalized citizenship. Secondly, that you couldn't discriminate based on voting based on race. And then for women,
Mm.
that was decades later before they got the right to vote. And then in the 60s, right, LBJ passes the 1964 Voting Rights Act and allegedly says, I've just, lost the South for the foreseeable future, basically. Why is that? It's because Southern politicians didn't want more equity, more rights going to people of color, particularly Black people. And so they were going to vote as a bloc against any party that would extend increased civil rights to these populations. And it goes on and on and on. I mean, we can talk about Reagan, we can talk about the Bush years, all of these things. And how it affects me is I wasn't that political prior, I would say, to maybe 2015, 2016. I would vote, but I wasn't that engaged. But with the Black Lives Matter movement, with studying history especially, it has increased the level of urgency for me around our politics. And I hope that by reading these stories of many people who were actively engaged in the political process, many of whom ran for elected office and who were also Christian and Black, that it would also provoke us to think critically about our current time and how that fits into the stream of history.
So good. So important. And I think that so often the history gets ignored, not taught. I mean, then we could go there,
Mm-hmm,
but
mm-hmm.
like book banning and all that. But at the same time, um, there's so many just racist assumptions in these systems,
Mm-hmm.
in communities that are so entrenched. And in a time like this, one of the things I see, and you're probably right at the intersection of it, is there's this moment that feels different. I'm really hoping it's different as we elect what I hope is the first woman president, the first Black woman, the first Asian woman in the United States to be president. but it feels different. And at the same time, it's causing a lot of cognitive dissonance for some people. So for some of those people who might be listening, maybe you're overseas and you vote from overseas like I did for pretty much 20 years, and you've always voted on a single voter ticket, right? There's these white evangelicals we hear a lot about that have basically thought abortion is the one issue. Now it's all up in the who knows. It's all crazy right now. Like it's being, I don't even know how to describe it, to be honest. And so in light of looking at it differently, some people are seeing some shameful things brought out. And so I've seen some very respected Black pastors, even some Southern Baptists who've recently left or are still in it. And they're making the case, like you said, this has been how we voted forever and ever. And then they are getting really attacked by some white Christians, evangelicals, who are saying, you're not a Christian if you vote Democrat. And it's like, how are we still saying that in 2024?
Right,
How do you
right.
respond to that?
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Lori, for going there. I think at the very least, we need to talk about it if we're going to have not only a better understanding, but also some different actions that I think are more helpful to our neighbors, right? So, one, what's happening here? For at least the past 40 plus years, white evangelicals have been discipled by their churches and right-wing media to think that the only truly Christian way to vote is to vote Republican. So what we're up against is literally generations of conditioning, which has vectors in the church. That is, they're hearing about it through pulpits and pastors and Bible studies and Sunday schools, and oftentimes without any other sort of Christian voice or witness to say, hey, there is another way to think about faith in politics, which is the second thing that goes on. When people say you can't be a Christian and vote Democratic, I ask, well, what do you do about all the Black Christians? Because as you look at it democratically, not only racially do Black people tend to vote Democratic, but also as a racial demographic, Black people are more likely than general population to be religious, and that religion is overwhelmingly Christianity. So therefore, you have a bunch of Black people who say they're Christians and voting Democratic. So if you say you can't be Christian and vote Democratic, are you discounting all of these Black voters? Are you discounting the Black political, theological tradition? That's a question I've asked on social media directly.
I've noticed.
Nobody wants to answer it directly. I'm sure they have their private thoughts, but that's the implication. So we ought not go around saying you can't be Christian and vote X, no matter what the party. And then lastly, I would say, on their own terms, with abortion as the primary, if not only, issue for many evangelicals, Trump has said he's not going to be anti-abortion. He's not going to outlaw it. So has never directly answered the question on whether he would sign a national ban. And right now, the talking point is this decision goes back to the states. So ostensibly, there will be states that do approve abortion, and he's not going to do anything of it. So about it. So there's pro-abortion, and in their terms, pro-life candidate is not actually doing what they say they're voting for him to do. So once that's off the table, because he said it is, then where are you? How does your political calculus change? What else are you looking at?
Exactly. I think that's where we're at. And that's been my conclusion and the conclusion of many others as we're watching this unfold, which sort of leaves, in my perspective, that now we're really talking about the white supremacy. Now we're really seeing what's underneath that whole single issue voter. The people who supposedly, held their nose and voted for Trump. And now that it's not this way, are you still voting for him? Whether you're saying it out loud or not? Because if you are, why? And is there a lot of shame we need to unpack? So your book, The Spirit of Justice, is helping people understand that justice is work that's deeply spiritual. Why did you write this book? And what are you hoping people come away from it with?
I think I wrote this book for a couple different audiences. If we're talking about Christians, particularly white Christians, a lot of times the impact of segregation in our society and our churches is you have no concept of how Christianity is practiced outside of your own group. You don't know how Black Christians practice religion, and it's broad and diverse, of course. But honing in on issues of race and justice, there is a very different tradition in the Black Christian tradition than we see in many white Christian churches. Again, I know people listening, not all white people. I get it.
You don't have to say that here.
I always encounter someone, and
Yeah.
even though I just want to, put it out there in
Yeah.
case it's in anyone's mind. And by the way, there are some white Christians featured in the book because there is an abolitionist, anti-segregation kind of tradition in some white churches as well. So that's there. But one of the reasons I wrote the book was to help people know there's a different way than maybe you've heard to follow Jesus, particularly when it pertains to race and justice. And I think it's a better way because in many ways, the Black church arose as an ecclesiastical rebuttal to white supremacy.
Yeah.
Explicitly to challenge white supremacy and racism. So there's a lot to learn there. But there's a second reason I wrote the book. Laura, you have a great perspective because you've been to different countries. You've seen how they do politics differently, some better, some worse. But, not this binary, Republican, Democrat, kind of a thing that we are mired in. And the reality is the system is not functioning very well. Not when it comes to serving all people, and especially the people with the least money, the least power, all of that kind of thing. So the reality is we are in a very precarious time. One of the things that travel has done for me is really value the peaceful transfer of power that for the history of this nation since the Constitution was ratified, we've been able to move from one national leader to the next without some violent conflict every single time, right?
Yeah.
I think people underestimate that. And they also have too much confidence that since it's been like that, it will always be like that. It may not. And January
No.
6th was a preview, right? So all that to say, the reason I wrote the book is because I think we need some encouragement. What happens when things feel perhaps even more chaotic, when things turn even more tense, perhaps when there is political violence in some way, shape, or form? I think as a nation, and particularly as people of faith, we need some resilience in this area because it could get a lot harder before it gets easier if it does. So I think these stories inspire us to keep the faith as we learn about the true stories of people who, under very adverse conditions, were able to find ways to resist and hold on to their faith at the same time.
So exciting to think about people picking up your book and being inspired in that way. I myself personally have deeply benefited from the faith and the resilience of both British people of British descent whose families and ancestors came from places like Nigeria, and also some Nigerian Americans as well. And here in California, people who their ancestors were brought to these Western nations had to somehow learn how to survive in ways a lot of people in humanity and in our other, family trees haven't had to. Just to juxtapose, your family ancestry and your experience of going to Africa. I went with my mom to the UK. She came along on one of my business trips, and we traced some ancestors like in Scotland and Wales and the UK, all over England, and went to some little spot in Wales where we have like a 14-year-old boy ancestor who came on a boat by himself to a Quaker community during a time of religious persecution. Was it difficult? Was there trauma? How in the world did a 14-year-old boy get on that ship by himself? But it seems though he chose it, So in my family history, I don't have the trauma that somebody was forced and chained into a boat. And so as we unpack all of our stories and just eliminate the shame of who did what to who and stay curious, that's how we move forward. How we go backward is to start blaming immigrants for
Mm,
eating dogs and cats, which is crazy, or to say, Venezuelan gangs are going to go attack Taylor Swift because she endorsed Kamala Harris. All of this stuff is so racist. I grew up in Venezuela, and so it's very offensive to me. And I also love Taylor Swift. But you should never say that to anybody.
right,
Just
right.
stop sexualizing women and threatening them with sexual violence in the political sphere, right? But as we unpack some of these very, very hard things, and we do, I think, need hope going forward, one of the things that I have really benefited from, as I mentioned, are people in my life who have learned some of this resilience through much more difficult
Mm.
experiences. And I hope that people listening lean into that because of your book and because of people like you speaking out. Um, in your book, was there anybody in particular that really inspired you, that had that story of resilience, that really just faced some awful stuff and knew how to move forward, that really inspires you?
I opened the book with an eyewitness account of something that Myrlie Evers-Williams said. Folks may recognize her name. Her husband, Medgar Evers, was shot and killed in front of their home in Jackson, Mississippi in 1963 for his work on voting rights in the NAACP. So in December 2017, the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum has its grand opening. Myrlie Evers-Williams speaks at the event, which I think in and of itself is amazing. It's breathtaking because for many reasons, but one reason was the exact rifle used to shoot and kill her husband was on display in the museum. And I cannot even fathom like being a foot or two away from that weapon and then going out and giving a speech that's televised nationally. And then afterwards, she held a press conference that I was able to attend with just, maybe a couple dozen people. And a journalist asked her, well, how does now in the 21st century compare to back in the 60s in terms of civil rights and racial justice and whatnot? Her answer was pretty depressing. She said, I'm seeing things now that I hoped I'd never see again. With the negativism, the division, the tension, the violence, all of those things. And she was in her 80s at the time. And as we're recording, she's still alive today. And she said, I'm a bit weary, which is like the
Mm.
understatement of a century. Of course, you're weary. Um, and I would not have blamed her one bit and half expected her to just be like, I'm passing the baton. I'm going
Mm.
to enjoy my grandchildren. I'm going to sit poolside and y'all take it from here. But she didn't even say that. She said, something I'll never forget. She said, but there's something about the spirit of justice that
Mm.
makes you determined all over again. And that just arrested my attention, that phrase, the spirit of justice, because first of all, I'm, jaw on the floor in awe of this woman who is still resilient, is still willing to stand up and fight for justice, even after her husband was stolen from her, even after decades of activism after that. And then I said, you know what? And the remarkable thing is not just her, it's not just her, it's in every era of US history, there have been these people who
Yeah.
stood up for justice. And I was like, wow. And to me, it's that spirit of justice that rises up within you, that says, this isn't right. We don't deserve to be treated this way. I have dignity, and I
Mm.
will assert my dignity to make this world a better place for me and my community. And that's one of the many people who inspired me in this book.
So beautiful. It's hard to even, wrap our minds around something like that.
Mhm.
And it feels so, as I've spoken with many people over the now several years of living in the United States about what it has meant to grow up as a Black person in the United States in different ages, and just doing a lot of listening and learning people's personal narratives and their own family and their own lived experience. One thing that often strikes me is, uh, well, one, the exhaustion of what that must be, but also the second thing would be, why aren't more people picking up the mantle and
Mm,
helping?
mm,
Um, and so many people have responded that when you're so close to it, you live it every day. And so there's not an option. It is a privilege to not think about it, to, hear Trump say to Kamala Harris, well, you used to be Black and now you're not Black. And it's just weird. And and like, I hate that she even has to stand there and listen to that kind of verbal assault, right? But it does thanks to so many people listening. And you don't get to take a break from that. So how is your writing of this book? How has that, maybe enhanced that thought for you or changed it in some way? And is it congruent at all with that?
I was eager to write this book, honestly, because I had it in mind when I was writing The Color of Compromise, my first book. That
Okay.
came out in January 2019. I didn't have the form and the contour of this book per se, but I was eager to tell the other side of the story. So, in simple terms, The Color of Compromise is white people behaving badly
Yeah.
around race, right?
Right.
So it's really depressing stories, some really shocking things that people said. Like by now we all know the Southern Baptist Convention came about because of a split among the Baptists prior to the Civil War in 1845. But what I think is really important for us to recognize is exactly why that split came about, which was about overseas missionary work. And so the conflict was, can this particular person be an overseas missionary in good standing with the denomination while they enslave people in the United States? And the irony to me is they were probably going to a country whose population was primarily Black or brown. Meanwhile, they're enslaving Black people there at home. Those stories need to be told, because if we want reconciliation, then you have to have truth, right? You have
Yeah.
to confess what actually happened, right? The Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, all those kind of things. But that's only one part of the story. So constantly, while I'm telling that side of the story, I also want to be like, well, what about Black Christians? Because
Yeah.
somehow we were able to hear this message of the gospel, which, by the way, was in Africa long before it was in Europe. So it's not like,
Yeah.
these Europeans introduced Africans to Christianity. But, over time, where you have more and more Africans literally born in America, African Americans, they were able to hear this gospel, you know, through the mouths of enslavers, but still hear the voice of Jesus talking about their dignity and liberation. And so I wanted to tell that side of the story. And I talk about so many people like Jarena Lee, who talks about, is Jesus half a savior? Because she felt a call to preach, and she wasn't allowed to preach at that time as a woman and a Black woman. And so, but she persisted, and it took 10 years, but she finally became the first woman authorized to preach in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. I talk about Prathia Hall, and she was a woman who was alive up until the 80s. She was very active, especially in the civil rights movement, and is purported to be the person that Martin Luther King Jr. got the "I have a dream" phrase from. There was a church burning, and she was a civil rights worker. They were there in the aftermath, praying over the people in the congregation. Martin Luther King Jr. happened to be in the crowd. Prathia Hall was praying, and she used this phrase over and over again: "I have a dream, I have a dream, I have a dream." Afterward, King goes up to her and says, "I really like that. Can I use it?" And she's like, "Sure, go ahead." But she also has a rich theological mind and teaches, I believe, at Boston University in theology. And she has something called freedom faith. And it's this idea that our faith shouldn't just be, for our own personal whatever. It should make society a better place. It should liberate people. And she shorthand called that freedom faith. So I wanted to tell that side of the story as well. And there's dozens and dozens of others that I think give us a broader perspective of how Christianity can fight and confront racism rather than compromising with it.
So good. I think that there's such power in story, which is why I love podcasting, because people come with their stories and
Yes.
we can often relate to parts of them, but they also kind of draw us in and empathy if we listen well to hear how people are feeling about it. And certainly history is full of that. And so putting that together artfully in this book for us to read all together is just a real gift. And I'm so grateful to you for writing it. And walk through this election season, everybody in the United States or whether you're voting abroad. Please especially listen to this in light of everything that Jemar is saying, because there's a lot of information out there that would seek to, just like propaganda does, make our minds see human beings made in God's image, God's children, in a way that we should not be looking at people. And it's very self-centered, and it's the opposite of that freedom faith that you're mentioning. I'm going to have you hang out, Jemar, with our difference makers, and we're going to talk a little bit about some calls to action there. But I just want to say thank you so much for this conversation, for writing this book. How can people find you and order your book?
So the book, The Spirit of Justice, is available wherever you get your books. It's on sale now, and you can also keep up with my writing because it takes a long time to write a book. So if you want something in the interim, I write frequently at my Substack, which is kind of like a newsletter on steroids. And you can subscribe there, jemartisby.substack.com, free. Or if you want to support my work, you can also become a paid subscriber at jemartisby.substack.com.
Thank you, Jemar, for this conversation. I wish you all the best with this book release. I pray that a lot of people order it and read it, and it really does inspire them with the people that you've put in this book for us to learn from.
Thanks so much.